me tonight is State Senator Brad Hoylman from Manhattan.
Yes.
And it's a new year. There's a lot of hope, a lot of new legislation, old legislation. One big question this year is rent regulation. Those laws will be expiring in June. There's a question of will they be renewed, will they be strengthened? What is your perspective? What would you like to see happen there?
Yeah, well, thanks. First, John, really appreciate you having me here today. And I think, today we're all mindful of the passing of Governor Mario Cuomo and what he did to help the underdogs in New York State. And I hope my colleagues go into this session learning and understanding more about Governor Cuomo's legacy in that regard. And certainly rent regulation and the renewal of the rent laws in New York City. There are 1 million rent-stabilized tenants who depend on that structure existing, and I am going to make it one of my priorities to make sure that it does.
Another issue, a bill that you've carried has to do with gay conversion therapy. Tell me about that, and what are the chances that could pass, especially in the context of the Republicans winning an outright majority in the state Senate? There's questions about various progressive bills that might have a harder shot to getting passed this year.
Yeah, well, the issue of conversion therapy, when therapists try to convert kids from being gay to straight, I think it's a nonpartisan issue. It has banning the practice actually had bipartisan support in states like New Jersey, where Chris Christie signed it into law, in California. So I think it's something we should move on this session. I think we all share the notion that we need to protect our kids from harm, and it's an important consumer fraud issue because parents are being cheated out of thousands and thousands of dollars through this sham kind of psychotherapy that really, really does hurt kids.
Sure. And we just heard the state comptroller refer to that $5.1 billion in money from bank settlements. Whether or not you call it a surplus, I'm not sure. But, maybe that'll make the budget process a little bit easier this year. What would you like to see that money spent on?
Well, you hear a lot about tax cuts and, returning money to people's pockets. And look, I'm in the camp that trickle-down economics doesn't work. It's never worked. And we need to think about how we're funding our infrastructure, how we're funding our public school system, how we're funding mass transit. In my district, I have a number of subway lines. The MTA capital plan is in the red for about $18 billion. Public housing is in the red about $14 billion. Certainly that $5.1 billion from the bank settlement money should be used toward infrastructure. I hope it helps address a lot of those crumbling infrastructure issues in my district in the city of New York.
And now some budget experts say this money should not be spent on recurring expenses. If you spend the money this year and it's something that gets built into the system, where will the money come from in future years? Is that a concern for you? Should it be spent on, should you avoid one-shots, basically?
Well, I think there's probably broad consensus that it's more of a one-shot notion because budgeting would necessitate that you have it in future years. At the same time, there are a lot of expenses that we need to address in terms of the MTA capital budget and certainly our public housing, as I mentioned, our public housing stock in New York City. So I think, though, we need to prioritize where in the state we actually need the infrastructure. The public housing stock and our mass transit system are important to our future economic success for the city and, frankly, for the rest of the state. So I think we need to look beyond, trying to categorize how the money is to be used and look at how it will lead to long-term economic growth.
Okay, sure. And any other top priorities for the new session?
I think we as legislators have an obligation to look at ourselves and our own ethical standards, and we need to do a better job in convincing our constituents and the voters of the state to have greater confidence in us. And I certainly think that we should look at issues like outside income, like campaign finance reform, like greater transparency and disclosure among members of the legislature, but all public officials. And so I hope that campaign and ethics reform rises to the top of this year's legislative agenda.
And last year, one of the big issues was public financing of campaigns. There was a big push for that. It was unsuccessful. Is that pretty much dead this year?
Well, I never would say it's dead because I strongly believe in it, and I'll fight for it, until my last day in the state senate. But you have to be practical at the same time, and there are other ways, in addition to campaign finance reform, that we can make voters feel more confident about the people they send up here to Albany. And one aspect would be making certain that legislators actually work full time and don't have side jobs where they might have fiduciary relationships to other parties. And so I'm hoping that that's part of the conversation that includes campaign finance reform, ethics reform, and other issues that really my voters in my district care about, cleaning up Albany.
Senator Hoylman, thanks as always.